was talking with Neelam Doctor, who's one of the candidates who's running for the Bitcoin Foundation seat, and he's working on a really interesting project that I wanted to talk to you guys about. They're putting together essentially an alternative cryptocurrency that's based off of Bitcoin, but that is going to be specific for an essentially legal tender in the region of Marrakesh. And so he's working with the finance minister to create this. And the reason why they're going with that versus a system that is based off of Bitcoin is because even though Bitcoin, I've done the math on this, the average transaction fee that I pay is somewhere between 4 cents and 6 cents on a per transaction basis. Yeah, it depends on what the exchange rate is at the time that you make the transaction. That amount is still quite large when you compare it to the relative size of the average transaction that takes place in this region. And so for them, Bitcoin solves some problems, but it creates other problems by making it so smaller transactions, day-to-day transactions, aren't really tenable. So they've taken the opportunity, they're still in the process of doing this, to try and fix that. And I think that there's one or two other things that they're tweaking about it. I mean, what do you think the future is for the decentralization of Bitcoin? Do you think that it's possible to have a one-size-fits-all approach with regards to things like the transaction fees that we don't see as a big deal, but that in other parts of the world are actually a real problem?
Are we talking about an altcoin here?
I believe so. Yeah, I haven't interviewed him yet specifically about this topic, but we had a conversation about it, and that's what it sounded like, that they're talking about an altcoin that's, again, based off of Bitcoin. And the beauty part for them is that because they're both cryptocurrencies, once money goes into their local altcoin, it can just as easily be switched to Bitcoin. So you've got the ability to save most of your money in Bitcoin if you believe that that's the cryptocurrency that has more potential. But then when it comes to local transactions, you can still have this essentially available to you, and it has all of the advantages that Bitcoin has, but it is also more tailored to your local environment.
This really reminds me of an article that you wrote, actually, Adam, on Let's Talk Bitcoin, called The Opportunity of Altcoins. And basically, correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounded like your whole point with that article is there's a huge opportunity to leverage the power of altcoins for examples just like this, where, for instance, maybe we don't want these high transaction fees, like 5 cents is a high transaction fee relative to the local things that we're doing. So we'll just make an altcoin that better suits that purpose. And that would be extremely useful to a certain subset of people. But then it would also have the advantage of being like similar to Bitcoin and kind of compatible with Bitcoin if you wanted to, for instance, have like a savings account where you saved your money in Bitcoin. Yeah, I think that's a perfect example of why altcoins could be really useful.
So localization and internationalization of some of the aspects of Bitcoin, I think, will be key drivers for developing specific altcoins. But at the same time, there's an enormous barrier to adopting an altcoin because of the network effect and the incentive to join the network effect of Bitcoin. Big networks have a network effect. Money networks have a bigger network effect. Money makes the network effect much bigger. So Bitcoin has this almost insurmountable network effect where, in order to introduce an altcoin that's popular, I think you have to have a very compelling differentiator, either a massive flaw in Bitcoin that you're fixing, or something that's compelling because of its localization, local culture, or whatever other local application.
What if the compelling thing is force, basically? I mean, because that's what legal tender is. It's like the government says you have to accept this money. So would that be a valid thing?
Force overcomes all kinds of incentives. So it's the most powerful incentive. So yes, of course. Well, what I'm saying is that, you have a world where beating Bitcoin will be difficult because of the network effect. But at the same time, you have these incentives to do some customization for local reasons. And I think in the end, that's going to result in essentially having a very large Bitcoin and, maybe 3, 4, 5 other altcoins surviving alongside of it in a global market. And you're going to reach an equilibrium where there aren't big enough flaws or incentives to leave Bitcoin other than the existing 2 or 3 altcoins that are surviving.
Well, so since we're talking about that article, I wasn't actually intending to talk about the article, just that example. But Andreas, my argument in that article is basically that you'll have all those problems so long as you're marketing to someone who is already using Bitcoin or is already aware of Bitcoin. But that only encompasses, less than a fraction of 1% of the world population. So if you go into a situation where there is no awareness of cryptocurrencies and the first cryptocurrency that's introduced is in fact one that is more tailored to your environment, as in this example, the transaction fees make more sense relative to how you would actually be using it on a day-to-day basis, then doesn't that overcome some of the network effect? Because simply put, the network effect doesn't exist there?
It overcomes some of the network effect, and with sufficiently strong local marketing, you could definitely have this island of an altcoin take off. I think that's a great opportunity, because what I predict will happen is that as that takes off, it will become exchangeable for Bitcoin. And as people become comfortable with cryptocurrencies and understand what they mean, change it for Bitcoin to take advantage of the network effect. And so that altcoin will eventually disappear. If the only compelling argument for keeping it from converting to Bitcoin is that people don't know about Bitcoin, then it will survive for as long as people don't know about Bitcoin. It will become the perfect marketing vehicle. And then everyone will convert to Bitcoin.
Since we're talking about that article, there were a couple of things that listeners brought up or that readers brought up that I think it's important to address. And I'm very curious for your feedback. The first problem was that when you're starting an altcoin, especially if you're based off of an existing proof of work, like the same one that Bitcoin uses, or even the same one that Litecoin uses at this point, you sort of face a very difficult bootstrapping problem where anybody can devote some of their mining power that comes from a much more powerful network towards your network. And in doing so, you can actually be vulnerable to 51% attacks from very low levels of hashing power relative to the size of other cryptocurrencies. So now, right. I feel like, again, in an environment where you have a local focused altcoin, that's not so much a problem because the bootstrapping should happen pretty quick if you're, going about it with a marketing campaign and it has all of that same early adopter incentive that Bitcoin has had historically. But how much of a risk do you think is there? And I mean, is that enough of a risk to say that it's better to use another situation that leverages Bitcoin and finds a way around the problems rather than creating an altcoin?
I would say yes. I think that unless you have a really compelling differentiator, all of these little incentives or risks or motives will gradually start adding up until they become insurmountable and you are essentially switching back to Bitcoin.
Okay, so let's say that we wanted to do this project in Marrakesh and we didn't want to use an altcoin, we wanted to use Bitcoin. One of the proposals that I've seen is to do it entirely in off-blockchain transactions and essentially to have geographic regions where they have a couple of payment processors that actually send the blockchain, but that for the most part, day-to-day transactions are happening on an off-blockchain, somebody's private database. So now that has advantages in that you can do essentially instant transactions because there's no confirmation time and there's no fees whatsoever unless they're put on by the platform, but it also has some disadvantages, right?
Or maybe a lot of the currency would be physically represented. So like essentially people would be handing around paper wallets. There's no real transaction fee for that. Honestly, what I was picturing when I thought, okay, there's going to be this government of Marrakesh and they're going to say it's legal tender, their altcoin is legal tender. What I was picturing was almost like a central bank administering the network, like completely taking out the decentralized aspect of Bitcoin and altcoins. And that's not Bitcoin. That's not a conventional altcoin, but that does sound like something that they would do. If they're going to say you have to use our altcoin, then there's probably going to be some Federal Reserve or whatever in Marrakesh that's running a bunch of computers and creating the network, or they're going to find some way that they don't have to do that or something like that, or that nobody has to run a network or something like that. I have a hard time believing that a government is going to say, this is legal tender. Now you make the network, people. You go ahead and create this network. I just don't think that would fly. So there's probably going to be something about it that's very significantly different from Bitcoin. And, to me, that would not be my preference. I like decentralized networks, and I think that's a huge strength of Bitcoin. But I could see a government kind of wanting to remove that portion of it.
Let's also just connect this back to the idea that people in other countries are much more comfortable with financial uncertainty with multiple currencies. So when I was in Marrakesh, we traded in dollars, euros, and the local money, but that was only the beginning of it. In fact, Marrakesh was the first place where I was offered camels in exchange for my wife, and and that was as a result of her incredible negotiating prowess. She basically sat down with a Tuareg, and after 2.5 hours of negotiating in French, wore him down to the point where gave up and just discounted everything. And they were so impressed by the idea of a woman out negotiating a Tuareg that they offered to buy my wife for camels. So there you go.
Did they think she was going to take the first offer?
They didn't ask her.
Do they think you were going to take the first offer?
No, absolutely. Well, first they flattered me by telling me quite clearly that there were not enough camels in the world for such an incredible woman. But then they offered me a more specific price. I'm not joking. This is a true story. Absolutely.
Well, it does make sense that people around the world are more comfortable with multiple currencies and
camels.
Yes, and camels.
Joining us this morning on Let's Talk Bitcoin, Andy Schroeder is the guy behind the Bitcoin Fluid Dispenser project, which sounds a little bit rudimentary, but it's actually, I think it's a really exciting project, and I'm excited to have him on the show this morning. Andy, thanks for sitting in with us.
Great. Thank you for having me.
So from 10,000 feet, what is this project and what does it do?
My Bitcoin Fluid Dispenser project is basically just the first of its kind, an automated system that can dispense a certain quantity of fluid, whatever you may like to sell. My present demonstration uses diesel fuel. Basically, it accepts payment from the customer in Bitcoin, and based on how much they've paid to the vendor, the dispenser dispenses that quantity of fluid to them. It has an integrated flow measurement device as well as pump controls. It basically replaces, things like credit card readers in traditional fuel pumps at fuel stations, and also provides many interesting features such as remote payment, mobile payment, and other things that aren't necessarily easy to do with traditional credit card-based systems. It also provides the ability to return change to the customer if they have overpaid, weren't necessarily sure how much fluid they wanted to purchase.
So one of the applications you're talking about here, as far as the diesel pumping is concerned, this would replace the credit card reader and kind of the flow mechanism at the gas station. But it's different. With Bitcoin, it's almost more like a cash purchase where you have to go, talk to the attendant and pay him the money up front, say I want $40 on, that pump, and then walk back out and pump to it, except there is no attendant. But I mean, you do have to figure out how much you're going to buy beforehand, right?
Yes, you do have to make an estimate. As long as your balance in your wallet is not very low, you're going to immediately get the unspent quantity back to you. So it's, in my opinion, not too big of a deal. I mean, whenever I go to a fuel station and purchase fuel, I typically, give the attendant either $50 or $100, and, I get that change back as soon as I'm done pumping. It does, require some estimation by the customer, but I don't think it's too big of a deal, especially since it's automated and so quick.
Right. That's actually what I'm trying to wrap my head around, what this sort of transaction, like if I'm doing it, what that looks like. And it actually, when you look at how it happens, it looks more like a cash transaction than it does like a credit card transaction, because, with the credit card transaction, you're essentially being metered as you dispense. Whereas in the other hand, you prepay and then are refunded whatever you don't spend. But like you said, it's automated in this case. So that's a really interesting approach to it. So with things like remote payment, what do you see as the use scenarios for this? So is this like, I'm sitting at my computer and my wife calls me and says, hey, I'm at the gas station, I'd like to get some gas. So I, send money to her gas pump from where I am. Is that how it would work?
That could be a very useful situation. The key ones that I first identified were, say an employer has their employees, whether they're refueling their vehicles or purchasing some other fluid, they can send them out to the location where they acquire that raw material, the fluid. And when they get there, they can just call up and contact some representative at their place of employment and request them to make payment for them. And this doesn't require the employees to carry around large quantities of cash with them or credit cards or have a specific account set up at a place that they repeatedly do business. It provides safety to the employee because they don't have to carry around something valuable with them. It also provides safety to the employer because sometimes you might have untrustworthy employees, and also saves time the drivers don't have to check in with someone or do any kind of paperwork. The paperwork could all be done by someone remotely. You also could be mugged or something. That's, an unfortunate situation, but maybe a more leisurely application. Say you're traveling to some exotic location, in another part of the world. You don't even necessarily want to have access to a lot of funds because you may be in a very dangerous location. And if you can only contact someone and have them make a payment for you, that might provide some additional safety for you that is almost preventative to an actual theft. So those are just some ideas that I've come up with. I mean, maybe others come up with something else, but those are my initial thoughts.
So this is sort of a basic infrastructure level service. And yet, as you mentioned, I think you're the only person who's actually working on a solution towards it. How did you orient on this as a problem that you wanted to address? And how did you come to the solution that you did?
You are correct. I don't believe anyone has done this before. Basically, from my perspective, I'm extremely enthusiastic about Bitcoin. And there's a certain point where you read a lot of news articles and talk to everyone you know about it, try to get them excited. And there's a certain point where you kind of feel like you're not really doing anything. You have to take it one step further. And this particular project was something that I felt that my skill set was fairly well suited to take on. I have quite a bit of experience in mechanical engineering, electrical engineering, computer networking, software development. I'm also very interested in the energy industry, fuels, fluids, and this just seemed like the best to move Bitcoin closer to mainstream. And I really think it's critical that people start looking at commodities that are not collectibles, things that are consumed. I would love to see, grain or coal or many other critical raw materials in society to be available via Bitcoin. And this just happens to be one that I felt that I could, make a dent in.
You identify consumables specifically. Why are consumables specifically so important for Bitcoin?
Well, consumables are something that, humans need to survive. I didn't really mention produce or corn on the cob or, peaches, but these are things that people need to survive. If Bitcoin is going to have any usefulness, then it needs to provide people the option to trade for something that they need daily. There are companies out there, I believe, that, have online businesses where they will trade gold or silver for Bitcoin, which is definitely a great commodity to be able to trade Bitcoin for. But at the end of the day, gold doesn't help you survive. That's really what humans need to do. That they can't live off of gold. It just happens to be a mechanism for trading for necessities of survival. Beauty can be attained through gold jewelry, but it's not a primitive part of human society. That I see commodities to be so important, specifically consumable commodities.
So it has to be normal. I mean, right? In a nutshell, it has to be normal and part of everyday life.
Yeah, I mean, when I try to convince people how awesome Bitcoin is, they say, "Well, what can I do with it?" It's like, well, you can buy stuff online, you can post an ad on Craigslist and try to buy or sell something, through a barter transaction with Bitcoin, but they don't see it as something that can provide them subsistence. And that's really where I think we need to be going to make this something that is really integrated into society.
You have a functional prototype right now that actually, there's a 20-minute video demonstration that you've put together. We're going to link to in the show notes for this. Your demonstration unit looks like it's functional. It looks like it's not held together with string and bits tape. So where are you in your project and what's kind of your next step?
Something I can definitely say I'm doing. I will be at the Cincinnati Maker Fair next month, showing my demonstration that you can see in the video in person. I try to make the video as detailed and believable as possible, but I know that people want to come and see things in real life and touch it, feel it, hear it, see the fluid moving, hear the pump. You can feel the pump vibrating as it's spinning. The prototype or demonstration is fully functional. I mean, it's definitely not production ready. It's is just a demonstration, but all the critical features do work. I'm also looking into developing a second prototype that more resembles a traditional fuel dispenser and would better integrate into the existing infrastructure of a fuel station. I do see fuel stations to be a critical application. I mentioned many more possibilities in my video that you're going to be linking to. And I've also demonstrated many mobile features, but I want to move to an isolated use case, which would be a fuel station. And I think that this definitely can be integrated into that existing infrastructure.
So when do you think we can expect to start seeing these? Obviously, there's a bit of ways to go between here and there. But I mean, do you have a time frame? Are you looking for partners in this? What are you looking for to make this happen?
Definitely be great to hear from a fuel station owner, within my geographic region who may be interested in demoing this type of system at one of their store locations. Obviously, I would want to have, the first unit dedicated to Bitcoin only. I'm sure that production units would, require traditional credit card as well as cash payment options as well. And that's going to be a bit more time to integrate, 3 payment options into 10 to 12 fueling units at a station. I'd like to hear from someone who is interested in new technology, is interested in Bitcoin, and someone that I can connect with within a reasonable distance from my location. I am currently in Fort Mitchell, Kentucky, which is very close to Cincinnati, Ohio, greater Cincinnati metropolitan area. That's what I'm looking to hear from. I would like to see some sort of demonstration available to consumers within the next year type time frame, but you never know what could happen there. I'm not sure if there are going to be any unseen barriers to putting one of these into a beta production type of application. I don't know when we can see these mass available, but I would hope sooner rather than later.
Well, we look forward to checking in with you as this project continues to develop. Andy Schroeder, the Bitcoin Fluid Dispenser project. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. It's been an honor being on the show.
Bitcoin has shown us that money and payments can be improved by the application of the same human energy, creativity, and crowdsourced real-time information that has made everything else better. And this is an epic insight, one that fundamentally shakes up monetary economics, payment systems, and even the involvement of all peoples in the world in the global division of labor. And this is the reason for the cryptocurrency conference in Atlanta, October 5th, 2013. The event brings together legal theorists, monetary economists, code-slinging visionaries, banking pundits, payment systems analysts, and dorm room miners for the purpose of making sense of Bitcoin's rise and to foresee the next steps. We are fortunate to be alive to see this happening in our time, and now is the time to learn, to celebrate, collaborate, and have fun. We'll see you at the cryptocurrency conference in Atlanta.
Can't make it to Atlanta? Let's Talk Bitcoin has you covered. We're capturing the whole event in high definition with packages available in either dollars or Bitcoins. Cheaper, of course, with Bitcoin. For more information, visit letstalkbitcoin.com/events.